Hi everyone, Dr. Duello here, delivering the first of two lectures on biological determinants of health disparities. First I want to comment about the reflections that you did. You'll be receiving them back next week. This week I'm giving you this video on biological determinants of health disparities. Next week, a former student of mine, Marisol Wolf, will be leading a class discussion on sociocultural factors affecting health, and she will return your first reflection at that time. You did a good job on the first reflection. As we go forward, we're going to dig deeper and deeper. I want you to recall that these are to be typed. They should have your name, the date, and the discussion section on each of the reflections. Actually, a number of students commented that there was not much under the category of fair and equal, but many of you indicated that you initially put things there and decided there were other categories as you listened to the discussion. So one of the things I want to point out when we're going forward here is absolutely we can disagree on anything. That's what a rich discussion is about. I also want to say, though, that because this is health disparities, because it's basically bad news in many, many ways, and that the goal is not to find fault. It's not that everything is broken, so we want to bear that in mind as well. On February 17th, as I say, Marisol Wolf will lead the discussion. Come to class with examples of socio-cultural factors affecting health. And I gave you that handout last week of all the different possibilities. And I want you to talk to people from different generations to decide what you want to put under all of these categories. Talk to grandpa and grandma, mom and dad, everybody. So we have the input from different generations as well. Second, I want you to write a reflection on how you're doing based on the food diary and the pedometer, and based on the information below, the recommended diet and exercise information. So you're going to review your food diary and your pedometer records. You're going to look at my food plate and look at what we should be eating, and then consider the Surgeon General's recommendation that everybody should walk 10,000 steps a day and see how we're doing. Going forward to the next week, you will be bringing a newspaper article on a health issue to discussion. Now, I want this from a newspaper with a large circulation. Yes, you can get it off the internet, but it has to be newspaper, a large circulation newspaper. Not the Badger Herald, not the Cardinal, not a journal article, not a magazine article, not an editorial. And I'll tell you what we're going to do with these when we actually get to class, okay? So today, biological determinants of health disparities. You had the assignment to view race, the power of illusion. If you have not done that, stop and do it now, because it is very important to see that before we go forward with this discussion. So one of the things I want to concentrate on today is what is this connection between race and health disparities. And I can tell you right now, I'm always using race with parentheses around it, basically to indicate that a lot of times we use it incorrectly, okay? So race is a social category, it's not a genetic category. And when people use it incorrectly, I put it in quotation marks. So we'll talk more about that. As we go forward, I want you to recall from the last lecture that we talked about socioeconomic status. There are a lot of socioeconomic, social-cultural, social-political factors that affect health. Socioeconomic status per se is income, education, and occupation. I asked all of you why are you in college? And of course it's to get an education because you want to pursue your occupation to have the income to live the life that you want. I also emphasized that there are biological determinants, but sociocultural factors affect biological outcomes, and biological factors affect social outcomes. On the first one, I said if you don't have the political power to prevent the toxic waste dump from being next to you, then you may be contaminated, and that's a biological outcome. If there is a mental health issue, that's a biological factor that may result in the social outcome of being a homeless person. So we want to realize that that's a circle and that those are not two lists. So before I go forward here, I want to make the point about the last lecture that what we see is all these differences, and they come back to socioeconomic status and the factors, the sociocultural, sociopolitical factors that affect those. Okay? So what we looked at was data showing that oftentimes racial, ethnic, minority populations are disadvantaged in income, education, and occupation. So that is why it's a socioeconomic issue that I want to make the case for here through the course. So one of the big things that happened was back in 1990, we had the Human Genome Project. And the goal was to sequence the entire human genome. And that may seem like a long, long time ago, to be 25 years, but boy, I assure you it's not in scientific time in terms of what's been discovered. If we go over here and look at 1996 on the right side of the map, you see that the first human gene map was established. If we keep going, we will see that in 2000, 2001, 2002, they had drafts of different genomes. And here in 2003, we have a finished version of the human genome sequence. And Dr. Francis Collins, who heads the NIH Human Genome Research Institute, jokes about this and says it's one of the first government projects that came in ahead of schedule and under budget. Now it's interesting, there are plenty of books written about the history of the Human Genome Project, but one of the things that's really interesting here is in the very beginning this started out with running an ad in a New England newspaper asking people if they'd like to contribute their DNA. And supposedly 100 people responded, or they accepted 100 people. Maybe somebody withdrew, they ended up with 99 samples. What's really interesting is that if you figure it's going to cost $10,000 to $12,000 to sequence any single genome times 99, that gets pretty expensive. So they started as a first step, or from the premise that maybe the hypothesis was actually that we're not going to look for genetic differences by populations of people. So what happened was they took the 99 tubes and they removed all the labels and gave them codes. So you had no idea of anybody's race or ethnicity or background or anything at all. But they still had 99 tubes, which is a lot of money if you're going to do that sequencing. And they made the decision to pool all the samples. So they mixed all the DNA and had one sample that they were sequencing instead of 99 samples. And what came out of this, because they were going to see basically how much variability there was. So in phase 1 of the Human Genome Project, they showed that humans are 99.9% identical at the DNA level. And this is in 2003. It's not the first 99 samples. Okay? So they established that there is no genetic base for race as a social category. There's no single gene that distinguishes one social category of race or ethnicity from another. As a matter of fact, they found that there was more genetic variation within what we call race than there were between races. There was actually more genetic diversity among quote-unquote Caucasian Americans and among quote-unquote African Americans than there were between the two groups. So one of the things that always interested me is we still have a lot of misconceptions about race, I believe in biomedicine, and I have wondered, have we not made it clear what genetic diversity really is due to? And we have 0.1% here that isn't accounted for. So are we, even as scientists and physicians, and that kind of subconsciously saying, well, that 0.1% must account for our differences by race or ethnicity. But I want to point out that genetic variation among the human population is going to differ for 4 reasons, okay? The first one is genetic drift. You probably, hopefully heard about this in introductory biology. And what it is that as people migrated, you had a genetic makeup, and as they migrated away and continued to reproduce, the genetic makeup differed, changed a little bit, again. So this is what genetic drift is. It is evolutionary time. This is not in your lifetime or mine or a matter of a few generations. This is evolutionary time. The next one is natural selection, which you probably heard about in high school as well as in introductory biology. And we usually use the shorthand to say natural selection was survival of the fittest. So if you go back to the cavemen, it may be the strongest people, the best who were the hunter-gatherers, the rest who made weapons, whatever. They survived the weather. Natural selection selected the people with the greatest skills, basically, to survive. The founder effect, maybe you have not heard of. Think of it as founders, founding mothers, founding fathers. And what it comes down to is that you have a population, and what they have done is reproduce within a group and amplified, basically, or perpetuated that genetic makeup in a group, a defined group. So what you will see is that on some of the Pacific Islands, for instance, there may be a high concentration incidence of a particular kind of cancer. Well, we're a very mobile society now, but picture that people are living on an island and they're mostly reproducing within the group, the people on the island. So there you have a form of geographical isolation, and you have that genetic profile perpetuated in that geographically isolated group. Or you may have a group who has chosen to reproduce within their own group, such as the Ashkenazi Jews. So on the Pacific Island, or among the Ashkenazi Jews, or any group that has decided to reproduce in a group for geographical isolation, by choice, by whatever means, and that you can have a genetic group basically defined there. So if you have genes that are beneficial, you'll see that gene persist, as well as a gene maybe that is detrimental. This is the founder effect. The last one is mutations. Mutations are changes in the DNA. The easiest one for you to remember is we wear sunscreen because UV light can cause radiation damage to the DNA and cause a misspelling basically in the genetic code. Mutations have existed across time. Some of the mutations that we have, we received when we were conceived. Some happen throughout our lifespan, okay? These are the causes we have for human genetic variation. Now let's go back here. This is from the U.S. Census Bureau, and it's Directive number 15 that was written by the Office of Management and Budget, the Feds, back in 1977. And it says that we have these racial and ethnic categories for record keeping, data collection, presentation of data on race and ethnicity, for administrative reporting and statistical activities. And here underlined, it says these classifications should not be interpreted as scientific or anthropological. Okay? They are not genetic categories, they are social categories. And what was happening in the 70s, I was around, you no doubt were not born yet, was we had legislation to address discrimination, to prevent discrimination in housing, discrimination in banking, discrimination in education. So this data collection was to find out whether these laws were being followed and was addressing issues of discrimination. So when you come back to this slide here, what you're seeing again is no genetic basis for race, okay, and race should not be used for scientific or anthropological reasons. And this was a good reason why they took the labels off and coded them from the beginning. That was good science anyway. But what happened at this point in time was there were a whole bunch of articles and a lot of excitement, whatever, in the press about race. And one of the things here on Scientific American, it says, does race exist? And my reaction to was these, well, of course race exists as a social category, but this was like trying to elicit a yes-no answer. Like it does or it doesn't, it's genetic or it's not. Well, we look different, but we're genetically the same. So it's absolutely a social construct, has been used historically to categorize people by physical features for social reasons. Okay, and if you go back to Race, the Power of Illusion, think about how successful or not successful you were in trying to sort people based on physical characteristics. Okay, so going back to this video as well, I love it. I believe PBS did a fantastic job. The points that they made here is that race is a modern idea. And race differs around the world, the concept of it. So our definition, our concept is a very United States type of thing. It's a modern idea, meaning recent, meaning not evolutionary. There's no genetic basis for race. Race, the categories of race were invented, if I may, to justify slavery on this continent, the North American. They're all human subspecies do not exist. I'm going to explain that in a couple slides. Skin color is only skin deep. I will show you that. And as I said, there's more variation within than between these social categories called race. We go down to 6 and we actually see that slavery predated our concept of race. And when we address the issue of slavery, actually race and the issues of freedom evolved together. So race was used to justify social inequalities as natural, that it was natural to use enslaved Africans as laborers, okay? But so race wasn't a biological or genetic category, which doesn't not mean that racism does not exist. I can almost plot on a graph the change in the issues and the education about race over my lifetime. I can even plot my own education. And at this point in time, too, there was an era, there was a time where some people said, well, you know, I'm colorblind. You know, I am colorblind, and that's why I'm not racist. Well, colorblindness isn't what we're aiming for either. Race is a social group, and that also has wonderful, rich, cultural issues and the diversity issue, diversity of thought. Diversity of thought comes from diversity of experience. Diversity of experience is in part difference in background. That's what diversity is about. So no, I don't want to be colorblind. I want to enjoy this richness, okay? So I want to divide these up a little bit. If we were going to divide these kind of into the social, cultural, and biological, how would I do that? Well, race, again, social idea. Slavery, historical issue, predates using race as a justification to enslave a group of people. Race and freedom evolved together, justified social inequalities. Racism is still real, and colorblindness is not our goal. You take the other ones, and what you see is this is on the what is not race, basically. Race is not genetic. I'll show you the subspecies that they do not exist. The skin color, I'll show you this in just a little bit. So let's go to this subspecies one first, okay? So for the issue of subspecies here, back from introductory biology, you remember how we have subdivided the plant and animal kingdoms. So our kingdom is we are animals, our phylum is we are chordates, means we have spinal cords. We are warm-blooded, our class is mammalia therefore. Our order is primates, we are hominids, and the genus and species is Homo sapiens. Well, you see here too that the subspecies is also sapiens. You can't further divide the species into different types. We're all Homo sapiens sapiens. The repeating of that sapiens means there is no subspecies. Now, in introductory courses, you may have looked at goldfinches, at birds, at some other animals where there were subspecies because they were categorically different. But in the case of human beings, we are not. It's Homo sapiens sapiens. So there is no Homo sapiens americanus. There is no Homo sapiens africanus. You don't divide us up by continent, and you don't divide us up by social categories. Let me talk here about the whole notion of color is only skin deep. So my PhD is in anatomy. All the anatomy departments are basically cell biology departments now, but they were called anatomy back when I did it. I both took and taught gross anatomy, microscopic anatomy, and neuroanatomy. So what we have here, and I don't have a good pointer here folks, sorry, but this is a cross-section of skin, okay? And the darker purple at the top is called the epidermis, epi meaning above, and that with the deeper pink on the bottom is the dermis. So the dermis and epi above it, epidermis, okay? This is someone who has the skin tone of me, very pale, very washed out, okay? So at the bottom of this slide, these heavy pink fibers and that you see are collagen. It's a connective tissue. It's connecting our skin to the rest of us. You can see that there's dark pink fibers at the base, and then it's paler pink. This is a looser connective tissue. And then we have this wave of purple across the top, and all of those spots are nuclei. And at the very top, that sloughing layer is actually dry skin. So the cells at the very bottom of this purple layer are called the stratum basalis, and among there are melanocytes, and melanocytes make melanin, and melanin is a pigment, a dark pigment, okay? We have other types of pigments, but I'm talking about melanin right here. So here in the stratum basale is where you have the cells that are dividing, they're pushing up, and eventually they're sloughing off at the top, and you keep having cell divisions at the bottom and produce more cells, but when they basically get too far away from the blood supply here, they're sloughing. This is someone with my skin tone. This is someone who is an African American, and you can see at this bottom cell layer, the purple, the stratum basale, these cells are actively producing melanin, the pigment, and they're giving the granules to the other cells. This is what causes darker skin tones. I have a melanin gene. I have all the pigment genes. I am 99.9% like all of you, but my melanin gene is pretty wimpy, which is why I'm so pale, so I do not have darker skin. I am genetically identical to this individual. All of you are genetically individual too. This is a different, it's in how much expression of a skin pigment you have. We are genetically the same. Okay, on this slide, I would like to make a point about this is the migration of Homo sapiens sapiens out of Africa. So this is one of the things that was concluded from the whole first phase of the Human Genome Project, is that we all originated in Central Africa, and that's where that red circle is. And what you have here is it's central by north-south, not east-west in Africa. And you can see all these little red dots that show migration of groups of people out of Central Africa and to northern Africa, across the India, into the Asian, Australian continent, Europe, etc. Okay, and if actually we look at the fossil record here, we see something that could overlie that. So again, at the same spot in Africa and Central Africa, we have origins of the human beings that exist on the planet today, and you can follow this fossil record and see that it matches basically the last slide. Now, if you don't want to believe that, let me try with one more slide. This is mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, and it is slight differences in mitochondrial DNA across geographical space. So what this comes down to is that when you were conceived, when we were all conceived, the ova, the egg, got together with the sperm. The sperm penetrated the egg. The sperm head basically penetrated, and the tail of the sperm was thrown away, so to speak. So we now have mom and dad's DNA together in mom's cell, the ova. The cytoplasm, the organelles were all from mom. So all of the mitochondria in your body today originated from your mother. And everybody's mitochondria did. So if you want to trace a maternal lineage, you look at mitochondria DNA. If you want to follow a paternal lineage, you do it on the Y chromosome, or father, okay, on the Y chromosome, okay? So here, though, you can still see from Central Africa, we had kind of the origin of these haplogroups and then variations as people moved out and migrated. And again, you can take that map and overlay it on this one of the migration of Homo sapiens. So think of this in terms of, we've got Central Africa there, and some people migrated, and that's one circle, and then some migrated some more, and that's another circle, and the X. So I'm trying to get the idea here of people moving across geographical space. So let's migrate out of Africa together and see if we can kind of grasp this. Here we have the African continent, here we have Central Africa. And there were a group of people 50, 100, 120,000 years ago, whatever, who populated Central Africa there. And one day, part of them decided they were really happy where they were, and the others decided that they were going to look around. So actually, they came to a body of water, and part of them decided to stay right where they are, and part of them crossed this body of water. They made some kind of boat, and they crossed the body of water, we'll say. So we had the original reproductive group. We had one that went to one side of the lake, and now we had the other people who crossed the other side of the lake. Part of them liked it on the other side of the lake. Part of them decided to keep going. They came to the mountains. They came to Kilimanjaro. And a bunch of them liked the view right where they at. The rest decided to cross. They then came to the desert. Part of them stayed, part of them crossed. So this is an extreme simplification, but think of this as Central Africa migrating, a reproductive group, migration. And this is genetic drift, folks. This is small changes in the genetic makeup over geographical space. And actually the anthropologists in that call these basically circles or areas clines, C-L-I-N-E-S. It's very, very interesting. So what happened was people were migrating here, and part of them migrated north. And the ones who migrated north were actually my ancestors. And they got here to the east end of the Mediterranean. This view of the Mediterranean, my ancestors took a left and they headed into Europe. And my ancestry is German, and this is where my ancestors are, okay? But I'm genetically the same as the rest of you. Another good way to look at this is a slide from Dr. Fatima Jackson, who is both a cultural and molecular anthropologist at the University of Maryland, College Park. An amazing woman who has lived in 11 different African countries. I would guess there's no more than a handful of anthropologists who are both cultural and molecular anthropologists. And she's one of them, and is truly an amazing people. So this just shows too that you had migration and then dispersion, okay? Diaspora, the dispersion of people across geographical space. Now a lot of us migrated like this, and then there was the tragic situation here of the transport of people that was not migration. This is the Middle Passage, and this is the enslavement of Africans taken to South America, to the Caribbean, to the United States as slaves, indentured slaves, and kidnapped from Africa. So not everybody came here by a migratory pathway, right? Let's look at this again. This is another slide of Dr. Jackson. Just, again, an amazing person. And what she has here is she calls this biological lineage, but let's kind of take it apart. So what we have here on the y-axis is we have years. In 20 years, figuring 20 years as a generation. So at the top it's the year 1600, at the bottom the year 2000. If we look at the x-axis, it says number of direct ancestors. So your direct ancestors right now are mom and dad, right? And mom and dad and your grandparents, there's 4 of them, and then they had parents and grandparents, and you keep going back. So look on the x-axis here and go out to 1,000,000, 1 times 10 to the 6th, and follow it up, and you can see that if you followed all of your ancestors back to 1620, what you would see is you have 1,000,000 direct ancestors. This means you had mom and dad, 499,999 grandmothers, and 499,999 grandfathers. These are not aunts and uncles, these are all grandparents. This is direct lineage. Now I also have a red arrow right here at about 1760s, 70s, and the significance of that arrow is this is when Thomas Jefferson lived. This is when he was born or when he was president. I'd have to go back and check. And for those of you who know a little detail in history, Thomas Jefferson had a wife, Martha, and he also, with whom he had children, and he also had children with Sally Hemings, who was one of his indentured slaves. So what we have here is Martha and Thomas Jefferson having offspring, as well as Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who was not so fortunate as to have a painting made of her. So let's look at how ancestors may evolve here. So we've got an ancestral chart, and purely for the sake of illustration, purely for the sake of demonstrating a point, I have made a fictitious ancestral chart here. What I've done is to say, what if Thomas Jefferson over here, that red dot, indicates that that's a mutation for prostate cancer. Now, I hope that didn't exist, but just theoretically, let's say that this was the case. And as I say, he reproduced with his wife, Martha, who they then had a biological lineage, and he also reproduced with Sally Hemings. So you can see that maybe there were male offspring in these subsequent generations, and maybe some of them ended up with this mutation specific to prostate cancer. Now let's say also, so again, I've represented all of this just to demonstrate, to illustrate, but this is one of the ways I envision that we have gotten to the point of thinking that a mutation is specific to a social category, African American or Caucasian American. So any mutation, again, whether it occurred in 1620 or any time thereafter, had the chance of being passed down. And especially now with all of the diversity and intermarriage of racial and ethnic groups, we're getting away from these categories, which is exactly what was demonstrated in Raise the Power Evolution in terms of having difficulty sorting people on the basis of a social category. So let me just go off on one point here. So when you think about somebody's genetic makeup, first off, think about what their genetic makeup was at conception, okay? Mom and dad, DNA, you're conceived, you have a combined genetic makeup. Now, if you're fortunate, your genetic makeup at conception and birth are the same. Hopefully nothing happened that there was any kind of mutation in utero. Not an absolute, but highly probable. Now think about, as you go forward in your life, how your, number one, genetics may change by mutation. And I've heard estimates that all of us probably have anywhere from 3, 10, 12, mutations, whatever. So anybody who thinks they're perfect, they probably are not perfect either, okay? But you have genetic determinants. Okay, now let's make a distinction too. Genetics is one thing, genetic makeup. Biology is a larger category, okay? So you can have illnesses or disease that don't necessarily have a genetic cause. However, they're still biological. They happen to your body. If you drink bleach, it is going to be toxic and you are going to die, not because it had a genetic impact or not because of your genetics, but simply because it was toxic. So there's the genetic makeup we have, but then there's what affects our biology, which is very much due to our physical environment. Okay, so we have our social environment, we have our physical environment too. What is that? It's the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the soil we rest on. All of your physical environment can impact your biology, and it may or may not be genetic. Okay, so there are biological factors that are genetic, but there are biological factors that aren't. And just think of, quality water, quality air, on and on and on. Many, many different factors. We're going to talk about this more in the second lecture as well. I want to come back again a little bit and talk about this misconceptions of race. So what has happened is that we, back in the 70s and that, realized what a huge problem discrimination was, and a lot of legislation was passed. In order to track that legislation, we started data collection on the base of race and ethnicity. And what happened is we have used those categories both in biology and even some, we're getting away from it, thank goodness, but in genetics. So we're saying, well, these are population of people. I still come back and say it's a social category. And in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about, again, a little more about where this confusion came from and some pretty big examples of it, and actually our ability to change our vocabulary and how we do this. Why does it matter? I can tell you, I can jump ahead and tell you with all the work that I've done in career, I think there's a very high risk in misusing the term race and ethnicity. And actually, one of you brought it up in your reflection, because we talk about clinical trials, and everybody, all peoples, should be represented in clinical research. And later on, we're going to have a lecture about ethics. And the point about research is that we, all human beings, are to share the risks and the benefits, okay? So when we advertise or recruit for racial and ethnic groups, are we studying sociology or are we studying biology? And sometimes we're studying biology because we know these folks are underrepresented. But are we sending a message that says that you are of a racial or ethnic group, you have a different physiology, you have a different set of genes, that you have a different genetic risk? I don't know of data for that. I know of no data that says there is a biomarker or a mutation for breast cancer or prostate cancer that differs by race or ethnicity. And if it did, it's about obstetrics and gynecology, folks. It's who reproduced with who. It's not race and ethnicity. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox right now. Next week, you will discuss with Marisol Wolf the social cultural factors. You'll be doing a reflection, and I'll be back then with another lecture on biological determinants. Be safe.